Like with any other entertainment medium, video game sales aren't always reflective of their quality. Often, we see great games coming out to widespread praise from critics and audiences alike, and somehow manage to not sell very well. Sadly, it's something that happens quite a lot, and in this feature, we'll be taking a look at 15 such games. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided ruffled some feathers with its abrupt ending, but no one could doubt that it was a great game. It built on the complex, systemic, moment-to-moment action from Human Revolution, offering players diverse choices in how they wanted to tackle any given objective, and all in all, was more than just a solid package. Sadly, at launch, the game's sales fell below expectations, and Square Enix ended up putting the franchise on ice. Both Square Enix and Eidos Montreal have said on multiple occasions that the Deus Ex series isn't done yet, so let's hope that a sequel isn't too far away, but it most likely is. Vanquish. Platinum Games has always been known for stylish, frenetic action, and one of the games that helped the studio build that reputation was Vanquish, one of the best third-person shooters of the previous generation. Vanquish had probably some of the best combat we have ever seen, and will ever see in a shooter. Sadly, like with many other Platinum titles, especially in the studio's earlier years, the critical reception just did not match the game's commercial performance, and it ended up selling less than expected, and way less than it deserves. Beyond Good and Evil. Beyond Good and Evil is by far one of the best games Ubisoft has ever made, even to this day, and though it's finally getting the sequel we've all been waiting for, eventually, that sequel may very well never have been greenlit. That's because the first game ended up performing very poorly on the market, and a lot of that was because of how crowded the release window was when it launched. The likes of Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic all came out very close to Beyond Good and Evil, which wasn't marketed very well either. As a result, the game just never managed to get a foothold in the market. Jet Set Radio Future. Jet Set Radio is to this day considered one of Sega's greatest properties. After an incredible debut on the Dreamcast that won plaudits all around, the series returned with a sequel, Jet Set Radio Future, on the original Xbox. But just like its predecessor, Jet Set Radio Future did not catch on with larger audiences. Sega had originally planned to make a third game in the series as well, but after the commercial failure of Future, that series was canned. Mad World. Another Platinum title that sold far less than it deserved. Mad World's striking black and white and red aesthetic, its brutal and stylish combat, and its buckets and buckets of gore set it apart, and the few who played it can vouch for how wonderfully crazy it all was. Sadly, the game's unique aesthetic just didn't scream mainstream to a lot of people, while controversy surrounding the game's supposed excessive violence also didn't do it any favors. There's also the fact that the Wii's main audience was mostly comprised of either kids or families, and Mad World just didn't appeal to that crowd. OKAMI. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call OKAMI one of the greatest games ever made, but back when it launched, it performed quite poorly in terms of sales, which was an absolute shame. Within 3 years of its launch, it had only managed to sell less than 600,000 units, which for a game of OKAMI's quality is a shocking figure. Grim Fandango. Grim Fandango has garnered a massive cult following over the years and is often cited as one of the best adventure titles to date, but the gap between its commercial and critical performances was absolutely massive. Though it received widespread acclaim, the game was deemed a major flop on the market, barely selling enough units to recoup its development cost. A lot of that could be attributed to poor timing, with the adventure games genre losing steam. Grim Fandango did so poorly, in fact, that LucasArts, a studio that had made a name for itself making excellent adventure titles, decided to bow out of the genre entirely and cancel all future adventure projects. Psychonauts. Grim Fandango isn't the only Tim Schafer-directed game to have received tons of praise but flopped on the market. Another game that sold way less than its reviews suggested is Psychonauts, the inventive and brilliant platformer that came out in 2005. The game's poor commercial performances led to major losses for publisher Majesco. Happily though, Double Fine eventually bought back the rights for the game, and after re-releases, Psychonauts has sold quite well over the years. We're also getting a sequel soon, so all's well that ends well, I suppose. Shenmue. It's weird to call a game that sold more than 1 million units a commercial failure, but the circumstances in Shenmue's case just weren't in the game's favor. Back when it released, Shenmue was one of the most expensive video games ever made, with a development budget of roughly $70 million. And even though the game did become a million seller, its sales were far from enough to recoup that investment. Shenmue's own eccentric nature no doubt contributed to those slow sales, but more importantly, the Dreamcast was a failing system with a very limited user base. Given all of that, Shenmue was fighting an uphill battle from the word go. KONKER'S Bad Fur Day. Back when it was still with Nintendo, Rare was one of the absolute best developers in the industry with a stellar catalog of games. And one of the best and most unique games they ever made was KONKER'S Bad Fur Day, a platformer with colorful, kid-friendly visuals where you played as a squirrel. It was a game with surprising amounts of violence, profanity, and all of the stuff you wouldn't expect if all you had seen were a couple of screenshots from the game. That contrast, it seemed, had a major impact on sales, with neither mature audiences nor kids seeming to know if the game was for them, while Nintendo themselves weren't too comfortable doing too much marketing for a game as mature as KONKER either. Giant's Citizen Kabuto. With its unique blend of shooting, combat, and strategy elements, Giant's Citizen Kabuto was a game that immediately garnered a lot of critical praise from critics and audiences alike. Sadly, that critical reception didn't lead to very impressive sales. At launch, the game sold poorly, though fortunately thanks to its cult following, the game has managed to sell a decent amount in the years since then. Back in 2015, a Kickstarter was launched for a sequel to the game. Sadly, in spite of the game being greenlit on Steam, the Kickstarter didn't reach its funding goal and the game was cancelled. Deadly Premonition. Deadly Premonition is yet another title that has accrued a massive, dedicated cult following over the years, but back when it launched, it was an extremely divisive game in terms of the reviews it received. Some absolutely loved it, some couldn't stand it, and those mixed reviews led to some pretty poor sales. The game was deemed a commercial failure, though doubtless strong word of mouth and the eventual director's cut release helped it sell more. Unexpectedly, we're getting a proper sequel next year, so here's hoping that one sells more than its predecessor did. Jade Empire. Jade Empire might not be one of BioWare's best-known games, but it's certainly one of the best. Its unique setting, beautiful aesthetic, and action-oriented combat endeared the game to a lot of people. Sadly, it wasn't enough. Jade Empire came out on the original Xbox in 2005, right at the tail end of the console's lifecycle, shortly before the Xbox 360's launch. And that, coupled with the fact that the game was quite different from what BioWare was usually known for, contributed to less than stellar sales. Killer 7. Mad genius Suda51 has made a lot of really good games throughout his illustrious career, and the excellent Killer 7 is definitely among his best works. Sadly, when the game released, there were many critics who didn't feel that way, and owing to the game's somewhat mixed reception, not to mention its multiple eccentricities, it ended up appealing to way fewer people than it should have. Shadows of the Damned. With its crazy action and unique premise, Shadows of the Damned was, from the get-go, a game with cult classic written all over it. Co-written by Suda51, the wacky action title definitely had a lot going for it, and those who played it would tell you that it was one hell of a game, flaws and all. Commercially though, it didn't perform too well and barely managed to crack respectable sales figures. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.